Thank you for joining us today. We have a topic that is on everyone's minds, and if not, it should be. The topic is healthcare and how it affects you as individuals and how it affects people in the Windham County area and how it affects one of the major deliverers of healthcare services in this region, and that is Brattleboro Memorial Hospital. Our pleasure for the first time in this setting to have the hospital's Chief Officer, Steve Gordon, with us. Thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure. Look forward to it.
Now, I have to ask, things seem to be changing faster and faster, and you had come into the job several months ago. What did you do to get yourself up to speed, both on some of these changes within Vermont and get the lay of the landscape?
That was a great question, but it actually happened before I came to town. I started February 28th, but really probably 2 months before, as I was leaving my previous job in Brockton, Massachusetts, I started doing my own research, both in details of what was going on in the state of Vermont in terms of new legislation to enact and look at a single payer system, to look at payment reform. Also did a lot more homework in terms of the community and in terms of the hospital itself.
The community itself, Vermont is, of course, known for the fact that our young people are leaving in droves and SUVs, taking a train, etc. But we do have a high percentage of more elderly population than some parts of the country do here. How does that affect the ability to serve them and cater to their want to live a long and healthy life?
Well, you have to have a vibrant hospital, vibrant medical care in the area. And, you know, Vermont has probably the oldest population in the Union. And Windham County is probably one of the oldest counties in Vermont. So we have very significant challenges from there. But on the other hand, we also have a very vibrant OB department. We birthed 370 babies this year. So on one hand, we do have an older population that we have to serve, but we also have a younger population that has been fairly stable as well at the hospital.
One of the things I've noticed, even more so over the last year, is that the hospital organization has taken to running or managing physician practices, whereas before a doctor or a group of doctors would say, well, I'll do this and I'll do the paperwork and everything. But now it looks as though more and more of them are becoming hospital employees, not just in Brattleboro, but elsewhere. How come?
Well, Brattleboro is probably the last hospital that really got on the bandwagon, if you will, for employing physicians. And, you know, back in the 70s, 80s, was a time where physicians could come out of medical school with reasonable debt and put out a shingle and start practicing. But things have gotten so much more complicated, both in terms of paperwork, in terms of malpractice insurance. Just the business of healthcare has gotten more complicated. We're spending $500,000 on a new practice management system, an electronic medical record for our physician practices. It's almost cost prohibitive for an independent physician to go out and create or purchase an electronic medical record. So the economics of practicing medicine are much different than they were, 30 years ago, when a number of our physicians came to the area and opened up their practices. And so younger physicians as well coming out now, it's not unheard of that they have $200,000, $250,000 of debt on the books. And they're not looking necessarily at taking a risk and going into a private practice scenario. The other piece of it, medicine itself has changed. Doctors aren't looking forward to call, being on 24/7. The hospital has responded. We now have a hospitalist service, so if you're admitted to the hospital, you get served and treated by a trained physician in hospital care. Your private practice physician can come visit, but your care is really managed by the hospitalist. There are some doctors that are still doing inpatient hospital care for their patients. But the vast majority of doctors coming out, certainly out of their training and residency, are looking at establishing practices both in an employment scenario because of the security, because it's cost prohibitive to do it on their own, it's like establishing your own business, and for a better life-work balance and not having to come in at 2 o'clock in the morning to the hospital to take care of a patient. So we've really seen a paradigm shift over the last really 20, 30 years.
Kind of is different than the old country doctor. I mean, I'll give you the example that I think of. When I was born in 1956, the doctor that delivered me at Brattleboro Memorial Hospital was a country doctor from Northfield, Massachusetts, who drove over the old, now closed Shell Bridge, and he had his office in his home. He made house calls, and really, it's changed a lot since then.
Huge. A doctor like that couldn't survive economically today, let alone getting malpractice insurance. So it just, like every other business, it's gotten much more complicated. Back then, and I'm a year older than you.
You don't look it.
Yeah, thank you, sir. But I think, back then, it was a cash business as well. Insurance wasn't as prevalent as it is now. And when you look at what insurance and bureaucracy has done in the physician practices, let alone the hospital, it's gotten it much more complicated.
Now you need to think about what insurance someone carries, what the copay is, and making sure that that copay is collected, because that's an important part of what's been a big buzzword out there, fee for service, making sure that the people who deliver the care, whether it's a hospital, whether it's a doctor, get somewhere near the cost of that service being delivered.
Well, and that's why we also have what they term cost shifting now, where you have governmental payers not paying really the true cost, and the true cost being borne by the commercial payers. So that's one of the drivers to look at a single payer system, so that you don't have that cost shift between the payers.
And nowadays, many of the physicians are in primary care. Some specialize, some do not. How does the hospital work with both groups of doctors?
Well, Brattleboro has been very successful in recruiting new physicians. We've recruited 5 new primary care physicians. This month, actually next week, we're opening up our new office up in Putney. We've been managing the Putney Medical Office for about 2 years with Richard Fletcher and Maggie Lake. We recruited Carrie Dickey, who's a new family doc, and we purchased the former River Valley Credit Union building right on Main Street, and we've rehabbed that as a new medical office. So Putney will have a new facility there with a relatively new doctor, and we're very excited about that. We now have Lauren McClure, family medicine physician, along with Peter and Janine Foote on Fairway Road in terms of a new office there with Dean Bresnahan. So we've really done a lot to recruit new primary care physicians to the area.
Do we have the kind of critical mass where additional physicians are needed, or how does that number look?
Well, I think one of the key specialties at this point, this summer we'll have a new OBGYN physician joining us, Ellen Garvey, who's a resident in Hinsdale. She's graduating from the Dartmouth residency in OBGYN. She's joining our practice. And we have a new hospitalist joining us from University of Pennsylvania, Ada Avick. Her husband's family is from Brattleboro, so she's coming back to the area. The family's coming back to the area. So we've been very lucky and successful in recruiting new physicians, and we've done a lot in terms of marketing those new physicians and taking new patients. The one area that we are currently looking for is an ear, nose, and throat specialist, and we have a doc coming the end of this month with his family to look at the area. So we're hoping that'll work out.
Well, as someone who has spent a considerable amount of time with ear, nose, and throat specialists over the year, I hope that they do choose Brattleboro.
Yeah, me too. Me too.
Now, the doctors are just one part of this. Over the years, Brattleboro Memorial Hospital has done a remarkable job on upgrading its facility. I would take note of just a couple of years ago the addition of the Richards building, consolidating a lot of different functions, but I see there's still more to go.
Oh, much more. We have we put in front of the state an application to basically expand the emergency department and bring it to the 21st century. The last time the ED was expanded or built in its current configuration was in the early 1980s. I think it was 1982. And the ER at that time was slated to handle about 5,000 patients a year. We're now close to or over 13,000 patients with very limited changes in the footprint and in the capacity, the bed capacity. So our goal with this new project is to double the bed capacity to 10 beds, not just the beds themselves, but also the purposing of the beds. One of the areas we have a real problem now is handling some of our psychiatric patients that we see in the emergency department or substance abuse, and we will have 2 secured rooms to handle those patients. We'll also have two rooms that would be for rapid treatment. So you don't have to wait an hour and a half. You can get in and out within 20 to 30 minutes if you have a minor injury or illness and be seen by either a physician or a mid-level. We've got to clean up even our registration function. When you walk into our ER, you're walking into the same entrance that the ambulance patients come in via stretchers. Then you go to the same desk that everyone else goes to, so there's limited privacy. We've been cited for that by CMS, Medicare, the state Joint Commission, that we've got to have a different approach for that in a much more private, compliant, confidential area. So our new design will have a separate entrance in the front of the hospital for ambulatory emergency patients, ER walk-in patients, as opposed to the ambulance patients. We'll also have 3 bays instead of the existing 2 bays that we have for the ambulances. So it's really a complete reconfiguration that really meets the needs of what we are seeing now and what we anticipate for the future.
So more shorter stays and less people staying long periods of time as a patient?
Absolutely, that's the goal. Is we've got to constantly look at reducing our wait times in the emergency department, and as well as reducing the number of folks. About 2% of our patients leave before getting treated. We want to get that down. Our goal is to get that down to 0.
I'm curious, are people using the emergency room who really should be using their primary care doctor in this day and age?
Of course. And part of it is convenience factor. The ER is open 24/7, and we take all comers. I think, though, what you will see and we're seeing it already, is more and more insurance companies saying, you got to go see your primary care physician first, or make that call first. But I think you're always going to see those minor things because of convenience factor. If a doc is off that day, the office might be closed. Where are those patients going to go? And they'll come to the emergency department.
You talked about psychiatric and substance abuse patients. Brattleboro, of course, is home to the Brattleboro Retreat, another fine healthcare facility.
Absolutely.
How much do you work with them in reducing what really could be a dangerous issue in your own emergency room?
Yeah. Well, there are a number of things happening in the local community with the retreat, as well as with HCRS. HCRS has recently opened up their own crisis center across from the retreat. Now, it's not 24/7 yet, but those are patients that are going into crisis that have an alternative to go to as opposed to coming to the emergency department. Now, if rescue brings a patient in, they have to come to the hospital. That's a requirement, a medical requirement for that patient to be medically cleared for appropriate psychiatric transfer to a different facility like the retreat or somewhere else. But we're all working closely together. We're actually now providing the medical coverage for the retreat patients. And that program started several months ago. So the other piece of it, too, is one of the programs that's really being promoted in the state of Vermont called the medical home. It's a concept that is financially funded by the state as well as the federal government, where we're able to work with primary care practices with a community health team involving both psychiatric services, housing services, with Brattleboro Housing Department, with HCRS, with the retreat, and others, to really wrap around those primary care practices other services that patients need to keep them well, keep them out of the hospital, keep them out of the emergency department. So we just started that program. Actually, Richard Davis is our care coordinator to bring in services from around the community to help patients that are part of the medical home. And we have 2 practices right now designated as medical homes. That is Brattleboro Primary Care and Wyndham Family Medicine. That's Tom Evans' practice. By this summer and by the end of the summer, I hope to have all of our primary care physicians that are employed by the hospital as part of the medical home, because we'll be deploying and having our electronic medical record system up, which will make it a lot easier for us to get those patients into this program.
So a bit of a paradigm shift there. In the past, you've had physicians and hospitals treating people who were ill, but some of the things that were making them ill were not being addressed. Now you can work on that as well.
And that's where I think everyone's looking at is, how do we move the system from an illness-based system, and that's how reimbursement works, to a wellness-based system. And it's very difficult to move that, to have that paradigm shift, both in terms of payment reform to people. How do you get folks to take care of themselves? We've got a huge problem with obesity, juvenile diabetes.
It's stuck in my chest here.
Yeah. But that is a whole issue of lifestyle, and how do we get the patients more, and the population more responsible for their own health care? Because we've got some big issues, a big bubble of juvenile diabetes and obesity that we are going to be faced with in the coming years, and it's going to play out in terms of more medical care.
The big question is, how do we work with community members in setting the example but not being punitive, with, of course, the realization you've got to be financially punitive at some point.
Yeah. And that's where I think the medical home concept really can work well, because you can bring those nutritional services to those patients. You can bring diabetic teaching, and we have a lot of those services at the hospital, but also in the community. But you also have to, as you just said, you have to have people motivated to take advantage of those.
Steve, we've talked about the hospital as a provider of health care, as a group of people setting the example for healthy living within Wyndham County. I mean, the health fair over the years has been really quite beneficial. But we haven't talked about the hospital as being a major employer in this community, in this county. And for a small town, that counts for a lot.
Yeah, it's huge. We have about 450 full-time equivalent, in total about 550 employees. Our payroll and benefits are probably about $46 million. That's a lot. And when you look at those metrics, I think that's either one of the either the largest, or certainly in the top 3 in Wyndham County in terms of employers. So we're an economic driver, and in terms of our employment, and in terms of providing the community with a hugely valuable service.
No, you're right about that. Where do you see that going? Because as healthcare changes, what people do and the numbers of people needed to do it are going to change as well. Has to.
And that's healthcare is one thing you can count on in healthcare is change, both in terms of technology, both in terms of our services that we offer. And for a hospital our size, and we're a small hospital, we're actually one of the larger hospitals when you look at Vermont, because the majority of the hospitals in Vermont are what they call critical access hospitals, 25 beds and under. And we run an average daily census of probably about 25, but so much more is done now on an outpatient basis, ambulatory surgery, all of the outpatient clinics that we have. I really look at us as not so much as an independent individual hospital with physicians, but we've got to start looking at ourselves as a healthcare system. And the technology that we're deploying now will get us there, that we can share with the physician offices electronically, their medical record, people's, healthcare information, lab tests, those kinds of things. So we've got to get to that point that we're truly a seamless healthcare system. And that's one of the challenges we'll have, because technology is expensive. And that's probably our number one capital, other than, let's say, the emergency department, which is about a $7 million capital investment. That is our next level of capital investment, will be the technology, so that we can be prepared for the future.
Can a hospital the size of Brattleboro afford to do everything? Especially because I'm hearing, thinking back to the last round of budget approvals by BISHCA, the State Banking, Insurance, Securities, and Healthcare Department. Remember hearing Steve Kimball, the commissioner, say that as much as they may hate to admit it, some of the smaller hospitals around Vermont are going to need to specialize in order to survive.
Well, and I think one of the examples is Mount Ascutney, which has really become more of a subacute rehab type facility. I think for us in Brattleboro, because our draw is about 55,000 people, 55,000 inhabitants in the area, that we will have to maintain and should maintain our general acute care services and our OB services. I know that I think it's Claremont Hospital, it dropped down to about 150 deliveries, and you just can't sustain an OB service with that volume. So I think our focus will continue to have those acute care services. We've got to be careful of what services that we'll invest in, and what new services. I mean, one of the services that I talked to Steve Kimball about is hyperbaric medicine, because we have a very vibrant wound care program, multidisciplinary wound care program. And having that technology, which are hyperbaric chambers, is a very positive one. We're having debate with the state whether they will let us have it.
And I was going to say, you currently are having the discussion about whether you merit a full-time fixed MRI machine as well.
Well, we already have it. I mean, the only question there is we've had the MRI machine for probably, I don't know, 5 or 6 years, certainly before I came, and it's part of what you need if you're going to have a vibrant emergency department to serve your population. You've got to have that technology, and it's not experimental by any stretch of the imagination at this point. So one of the parts of the ED project is to take the MRI machine and place it into space that was already built out in the building you mentioned, the Richards building, back in 2008, 2009. We have space already there, and we need to do it so that we can use that space to expand the emergency department. Right now, patients who need an MRI have to walk through the ER and our clinical area in the ER to get to the equipment, and that's just not the appropriate thing. And the ER lease is up, and we want to move that machine to space that's inside the Richards building that was already built for it.
If you were almost any other business, a lot of the things you speak of would already be done because you're reacting to market conditions. How tough is it to work within the regulatory field?
Well, Vermont for healthcare is very well regulated. I, ran a hospital in Derry, New Hampshire for about 13 years, then ran hospitals in Massachusetts. And what you have here is a much more heavily regulated state. Our budgets are reviewed, have to be approved. That's not the case in either New Hampshire or Massachusetts. The thresholds in which to bring new programs to fruition, financial thresholds, are much lower in Vermont. So there is a more highly regulated model in Vermont. That's the reality we function in. What's going to be very interesting over the coming months is we now have the Green Mountain Care Board. which it has a huge agenda in front of them. Everything from developing the different insurance packages for the insurance exchange that would be offered to Vermonters, to approving our budgets at the hospital level, to approve capital in terms of the certificate of need, looking at payment reform, looking at models of different payment reforms, moving away from how we're paid now on an illness basis, on a per test basis, moving towards more of the preventative, putting more of the risk, I think, back onto the providers, both physicians and hospitals, to care for populations. So everything is in change right now. As I said, Green Mountain Care Board, I think in July, once legislation is enacted, will then take on the responsibilities that are currently within BSCA, which is the Banking, Insurance, Securities, and Healthcare Administration, which Steve Kimball, as you mentioned, they will take on those responsibilities that formerly were part of BSCA.
Wow.
A lot of changes.
A lot of things changing. So how can the average everyday Joe not only keep a handle on all of the change, but make sure the changes are things that will be beneficial to them and the community at large?
Yeah. Well, I'll start with myself, being the average Joe too. And there's a lot going on. So I've been more active in Montpelier, more active with the Hospital Association. One of the things we're blessed with here is only 14 hospitals in the entire state, most in fairly non-competitive marketplaces. Now, we're in a fairly competitive marketplace here in Brattleboro because across the river we have Keene, across the border we have Greenfield, Franklin. So we're a little different here than the Northern Kingdom or the western part of the state, being in the southern tier. So I want to make sure that the Green Mountain Care Board and the folks that make up that board understand what it means to have a hospital in Brattleboro. What it means to our 450, 500 employees here, that we need a vibrant hospital in this community. So I see more of my role over the coming year and coming years representing us, not just from Brattleboro and the hospital, but the area with the Green Mountain Care Board, and getting more involved in the political process with our legislative folks here from Brattleboro.
Well, we're glad to have you in Brattleboro, and thank you very much for talking with us today.
Well, it's been a pleasure.
Steve Gordon is the Chief Officer at Brattleboro Memorial Hospital. If you'd like to know more about what's going on at your community hospital, go online to bmhvt.org. This is Tim Johnson. Thanks for watching.